So now I'd love to introduce our first moderator. Matt Beat is a YouTuber, video producer, podcast host, and musician based out of Kansas. He has taught various subjects in the classroom from grades 7 through 12. His YouTube channels, Mr. Beat and The Beat Goes On, have accumulated over 1 million subscribers and nearly 300 million views, helping to expand his classroom to around the world. His specialty is American history, but he also has a big passion for geography, economics, and politics. So I'll let you take it over, Matt, from here. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, everyone. Yeah, we have a panel. This is the first one, I believe, and I'm excited to be part of this. I'm passionate about voting reforms. If anyone knows anything about my channel, Mr. Beat, I've been making videos about voting reforms for at least 10 years. This is one thing I've been very vocal about on social media as well, sharing my personal opinions as far as these are the issues to focus on first and foremost, voting reforms. And so I'm really honored to moderate this panel. And I'm going to introduce everyone. We have one other person that might be joining us. Oh no, there they are. Everybody's here. Fantastic. Okay. So I will introduce everyone and then I have several questions to get to. The questions portion of this will be about 40 minutes. So we'll go until 2:40 Eastern, 10:40 Pacific, and then we'll go into breakout rooms for the last 20 minutes of this first hour. So we'll start with, in no particular order, I have Nicolaus Tideman, who is here. Specialty is economics. Got a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago, has been a professor at Virginia Tech since 1973. His many accomplishments in social choice theory include the invention of the ranked pairs method of Condorcet voting, and he wrote the book Collective Decisions in Voting to Potential for Public Choice. So welcome, Nicolaus, for being here. Make sure your microphone is ready to go here in a moment, or you can say hi now if you want to, just to test it out, Nicolaus.
Hello now.
Hello. All right, next up I have listed here Benjamin D. Singer, the CEO of the Show Me Integrity, co-founder and CEO of Respect Voters Coalition. Benjamin has worked on ethics, campaign finance, redistricting, and electoral reforms with leaders across the political spectrum, including Senator John Danforth, Senator Rob Schaaf, and Tishaura Jones. His work has been featured in TV, radio, and newspaper outlets across the country. Benjamin, thanks for being here. If you want to wave and say hi.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right. And next up, we have Marcus Ogren. Marcus is a researcher who uses computer simulations to study voting methods. Pretty cool. They are particularly interested in how voting methods incentivize candidates and other actors, strategic voting, and assessing voting methods that have yet to see much real-world use. You can follow their work at medium.com/@voting-in-the-abstract. I'll put a link in the here in the chat for everyone. And go ahead and say hi.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Marcus. And then finally, last but not least, we have Sarah Wolk, who I've collaborated with on my own channel. Sarah is executive director and co-founder at the Equal Vote Coalition and Star Voting Action. A big influence on me, like being a big fan of star voting, I must say. She has helped bring voting method reform to the real world by creating accessible educational content, speaking on national panels, and co-authoring a peer-reviewed analysis of voting method accuracy and strategy that has been published in the journal Constitutional Political Economy. Sarah, thanks for being here. Say hi.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool, awesome. So it sounds like everyone's microphones are working. We can see everyone's beautiful faces, and we are ready to get started. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna rotate. I'm gonna ask a question specifically to one person, and we'll rotate clockwise from what my view. And then after that, whoever wants to jump in and also answer the same question, if they have anything they disagree with or they want to add, just go ahead. Okay.
Sounds good.
All
Okay.
right. Here we go. Then my first question is, this is the one I'm most interested in right off the bat. What has been your biggest challenge? I'm going to start with, by the way, Benjamin. Benjamin, what has been your biggest challenge in communicating with the public on the topic of voting methods?
It's a great question. I'm excited to hear from other panelists on this as well. And for those who don't know, in St. Louis, where I live, we passed approval voting. Probably everyone here is already aware of that in a nonpartisan top two runoff context, but approval voting is used in the primary. And then we passed a charter amendment to protect that and ensure it didn't get repealed. Also included some redistricting and conflict of interest measures in that. So my top priority is always, how do you communicate in a way that's effective, that gets us to that point where we're getting these voting methods to improve the way we vote based on science into the real world. So I'm really excited about this panel. And I think what I want to emphasize here is there's a science, right? From me or from any other individual person, when we've been planning and running these campaigns to pass these voting methods into use in the real world, we all have our own assumptions. We all have our own reasons for why we want to see these things in the real world. The benefit of this method or that method, or we can probably come up with 15 different benefits to the same voting method improvement. But what matters to me as a voting method enthusiast, a democracy reform enthusiast, is probably not going to be what resonates with the average voter in the city of St. Louis or in the state of Missouri. And so I want to emphasize that the same way there's a science to improving the way we vote, there's a science to how we communicate to the public and to voters. And I'm sure we've all experienced this, whether you're advocating for star voting or ranked pairs or approval voting or something else. Opponents or skeptics will say, well, what if that? What if this? All sorts of theoretical arguments. Well, it didn't work in this one context, so it will never vote. Well, I think we all agree that's a little silly. We need to test these things in the real world. And that's the scientific method. Test it, see how it really performs. We need to try star voting in some cities. We need to try approval voting in more cities and more states in partisan contexts, which hasn't been tried in the United States, to really get those data and see how it works in the real world. And so for us, our challenge sometimes has been with our volunteers, our committees in St. Louis. People thought, oh, well, this one argument is what's going to resonate with people. It's about improving equity in the way we vote. I remember that was one thing that some volunteers on our committee on one of our last campaigns in St. Louis, we tested with a variety of other arguments that we wanted to try and see which one were going to be the most persuasive and help get us to a commanding victory at the ballot box. And it turned out that was not even close to being one of the top performing arguments. And so we focused on other messages to communicate to the public about why this measure was going to be an improvement. And we do the same thing with ballot measures. And I will say right now, this is the biggest challenge, is the ballot language that actually appears on the ballot. And I know that's been an issue for other folks as well. And especially when elected officials are putting things on the ballot and they can control the ballot language, they can really mess with stuff if they're opposing democracy. So I'll give one quick example. I'll just screen share here. So this was a measure the legislature put on the ballot in Missouri back in 2020. And it was basically to roll back some redistricting reforms that we had passed statewide with a campaign I'd been involved in as the communications director in 2018. And so then 2 years later, they put this on the ballot. And to most voters, they saw, oh, it's about banning gifts from paid lobbyists to legislators. But as you can see, the bottom, what it was really about was about rolling back these redistricting reforms. So the language that appears on the ballot really can determine whether something is going to pass, whether it's good or bad. and so as advocates, we try to do whatever we can to ensure that the policy we write and the language we use in the policy, then when it gets transferred to the ballot language, is going to be something that sounds positive to the voter. I prepared another measure, but I want to hand it over and not dominate the time. I have another example from in Illinois when I was working on campaign finance reform there. We had the same measures, but written different ways, and they could perform vastly differently just based on the language that's used. So I really encourage the folks here who believe in science, which hopefully is everyone, to use the same scientific method for how we run campaigns, how we communicate to voters, and even helping shape the language that appears on the ballot by testing how it resonates with voters. Because we're human beings, we're not robots, and so we have to test in the real world.
So again, the question is, what has been your biggest challenge in communicating with the public on the topic of voting methods? If anyone else wants to chime in now.
Well, I've got something. I think this in particular, out of all the panels, I was really excited to hopefully get to be on this panel because I see this as the crux. When I first got involved, I met a canvasser and they were like, hey, the Nader effect that, essentially spoiled the 2000 election. It's happened to both parties, Republican or Democrat, but you can split the vote. You can end up spoiling the election and getting a non-representative winner. And I'd heard those terms before and got really inspired. But as I got more into the science of it, I found out there are multiple voting methods. Most people don't know the terms vote splitting or spoiler effect. So we don't have easy words that we can use to communicate the problem. And most people don't know what star voting is. Most people have never heard of approval voting. Most people have never heard of ranked pairs or Condorcet, or even know how to pronounce Condorcet. Worse, people are like, wow, this is complicated, and in presentations, I like to do a show of hands and say, how many people know what the current system is called? Almost nobody can name the current system. So it's like Voldemort here, where until we can actually name the problem and name the starting place, it's going to be really hard to name the solution. So developing language for these kinds of things, I think, has been the crux of my quest over these last 10, 12 years in this space. And a big part of the work that I've tried to do was star voting with the Equal Vote Coalition. And it's interesting because we have a fundamental disconnect in terms of what we're trying to do. Like, on the one hand, we want to keep it simple and tell people the answer, give people a clear vision for what do we need to do here. But on the other hand, we need lay people, we need voters to be able to differentiate between these voting methods, differentiate between ones that do and don't deliver on their goals, differentiate between the different goals and be able to prioritize them. And that conversation becomes very, very, very deep. It's a fabulously interesting rabbit hole. So as soon as I got involved, I quickly climbed the ladder from, layperson to social media warrior, to showing up to my first meetings, to volunteering for my first research committee, to chiming in on the election science forums on the internet, and starting to debate some of the headier people in the space. And, when legislators or when, city attorneys or whatever go about the process of writing an actual ballot language, they're not getting that ballot language inspiration from advocates like me. They're getting it from neutral sources on the internet. So that's where they start citing, jargon terminology or using jargon and terminology incorrectly. And that just sets people up to fail in terms of the ballot initiative process. So yeah, I really think there's a lot that can be done here to standardize our language, to better name the enemy, to really bring it home and help lay people not only learn about this field, but get inspired by this field. And that's what it's going to take for people to make it down the rabbit hole and back out in a good place. So yeah, I guess one other thing I want to start off with is just to thank everyone for being here. I think you all have made amazing contributions. And I love that we have strong advocates on this panel for approval voting, for Condorcet voting, and for star voting. Those three are a really fabulous slate. So one of the things at Equal Vote Coalition that we've tried to do is, be the organization that is needed in this space. And what we didn't have when I first got involved was an organization that was inclusive of different schools of voting methods. So our kind of message right now is that whether you prefer a traditional looking ballot, a ranked ballot, or a scored ballot, we can have good outcomes. We can have fundamentally better elections. And yeah, approval voting has that traditional ballot nailed down really fabulously. I think the Condorcet family of voting methods, which we call ranked robin, in which you count all the rankings and the candidate preferred over all others wins, is a fabulous option for ranked ballots. And my personal preference, of course, star voting, or the 5-star ballot, or the Holy Grail.
All right, Marcus or Nicholas, if you want to chime in for this question, or we can move on to the next.
I will chime in very briefly and say that I'm coming more from the researcher perspective. And the vast majority of what I write is not intended for the general public to read, just people who already know terms like Condorcet method. And one of my biggest challenges with the stuff that is intended for the general public to consume is lack of feedback. For example, I only learned 2 minutes ago from Sarah that most people do not know what the spoiler effect or vote splitting is.
Yep, that's I think I see a lot of this in my comment section. So that's a valuable resource, I think, for you all. It's like anytime I make a voting reform video, looking at the comments like, oh, this is where they're at. Dr. Tideman, you want to have anything to add, or we should next question?
Nothing from me.
All right, I do have a related question, and then we'll move on to kind of more of the metrics. But I did want to ask. This is one of my personal questions that I just think about all the time. I think about the normies, the quote normies, the ones who don't follow politics closely. The vast majority of people, frankly, around the world and specifically in the United States, they just don't care about this stuff. So my question is, how can we make this stuff more sexy? How can we make this stuff something that the normies care about? We'll start with you, Sarah, for this one.
Well, I think one of our biggest challenges combating that, making this sexy for normies, is that almost by design, people who are deeply, deeply passionate about voting reform are not normies. We're weird nerds. And we have a full spectrum of fabulous nerds represented in our community from all across the spectrum on every axis. But yeah, I think it's important for us as, nerds to recognize that not everyone sees these problems the same way, and that what resonates for us may not resonate for other people. So, interestingly enough, the first campaign in Eugene for star voting, I came in at kind of the 11th hour after they had already collected the signatures. And we had a, yay, we made the ballot party with a big cake. And we had gotten enough signatures, we had qualified, and we asked all the canvassers, what was your opening pitch? Like the first thing that you would say to people that worked the best. And our two top canvassers, who had by far gotten the bulk of the signatures, both had the same opening pitch. It was not what we had on the script. So it's not what the campaign had told them to say. They had just tried a bunch of different things and then stuck with what worked. And it was, do you want to break two-party domination? That was the one. And me coming from, a somewhat more academic thing was like, I absolutely think that star voting is going to break two-party domination. I think that any of these good single winner methods can break two-party domination. The research proves that proportional representation can break two-party domination, but we don't actually have the data to make that claim. We have all of the logic, I think, to make that claim, and I can see no reason why a good voting method wouldn't break two-party domination. But people, whether or not they strongly like parties, they dislike parties, they want more parties, they want more representative options, and they don't want to be pigeonholed. So I thought that was really powerful.
Yeah, kind of the appealing to the majority independents in this country that or feel like they're always voting for the lesser of two evils, or not motivated to vote at all because of that fact. Yeah. Anyone else want to chime in on again, the question is, how can we get the normies to care about this stuff?
Yeah, it's a good question. And this is where, and Marcus, I think this speaks to your challenge too. We really follow the data. And so we do surveys and polling with, scientific sampling of the electorate, because we have to keep in mind, what's the role of the normie? Like, where does the normie show up in the voting reform movement, right? You only have, in general, in presidential elections, we only have about 70% of Americans even who are eligible to even voting. And then in primaries and local elections, you have somewhere between 10 and 35% at the highest point voting, typically. So then, if we're talking about the normies, like, we're lucky if they are even voting. And so their role in the movement isn't going to be showing up to organizing meetings. It's not going to be helping shape the policy. It's not going to be gathering signatures. It's going to be voting. So we focus on how do we communicate with them. And then it turns out, they're regular people and we're all people. We all have emotions. So if we can figure out how to communicate to normies, that might be a message that resonates broadly. So I'll share with you what so far has actually been totally private, proprietary information. So I'm going to be a little bit careful what I share, but I'll pull up an example of some of the messaging we've tested. And yeah, like folks have alluded to, in their earlier remarks, like some of what Sarah said, it's not what we care about. And I've seen a lot of organizations make mistakes of trying to talk about voting methods in terms of, the spoiler effect and vote splitting, things that regular people don't really think about or frankly care about. What people care about is accountability. What they care about is serving the people and dealing with like education and healthcare and infrastructure. Even infrastructure is maybe a stretch. So I'll pull up for an example some of the messages that we've tested. So like we tried something that we thought would, something that, in the voting methods terms might work well. And we have done a lot of testing of these types of messages before in previous voting method reform campaigns. And so we knew some things not to try, but like this measure will remove the pressure of voting for the lesser of two evils in primary and general elections. Performed pretty well, but didn't perform nearly as well as, here's one. With the current system, leaders are often elected with less than 35% of the vote. This measure will ensure that winners have broad support from voters. So naming the problem, like Sarah said, if we name the problem, that's something that helps. And that's something we found in St. Louis. where we didn't necessarily have the resource to run as evidence-based of a campaign in our messaging, but we often talked about how leaders were winning with less than 37% of the vote. And people don't like that. They're almost willing to say yes to anything when you talk about that. But the top performing message was, I'll read a couple of them, because I think these will help us communicate to normies. You don't even talk about the voting or the election itself. You talk about how we want elected officials to even act and who we want to have power. So things like, this measure gives voters more power to hold politicians accountable to solve problems that affect the people, like the economy and education. Here's another one. Politicians spend too much time fighting each other instead of doing their job. This will force officials to actually solve problems like the economy and education instead of just playing political games. So when you talk about the impact of these reforms, and this is something, of course, any organizer or any marketer, any communicator knows, you talk about values, you talk about the impact on people's lives, and that's what resonates with people because it hits them here instead of here.
Yeah, I like how those are tied to emotions and also connecting it to issues that are emotionally charged. And I think also I would add the appealing to their identity just as much as to their values, I think is worthwhile. Yeah, anyone else want to add anything on that question? Okay, let's move on. Let's shift gears slightly here, and I'm going to ask Marcus this first. What are the big picture metrics that we should be looking at when picking a voting method? What conclusions can we draw from such metrics?
Okay, so there's a number of basic questions we can ask about voting methods, and many, though not exactly all, I would say, can be answered with some sort of statistical metric. One very basic question is, does this voting method do a good job of electing the right winners? It sounds really subjective, but we can quantify it using voter satisfaction and efficiency, which I wrote about in a paper with Sarah here. And there's some others too, but voter satisfaction and efficiency is nice in that it evaluates the outcomes from the perspective of the voters themselves, rather than just saying something like, oh, a candidate who would be any other candidate head to head is the right candidate to win by definition. There's a lot of other questions we can ask. We can look at how effective strategic voting is under different voting methods, and there's plenty of different metrics for that. My more recent work has been on studying how different voting methods differently incentivize candidates, and whether a voting method incentivizes candidates to focus their appeal on a base of voters who are already favorably predisposed towards them, or if it incentivizes candidates to appeal to the wider electorate, including the ones who are going to at least dislike them under any reasonable scenario. Can the candidates just ignore those voters and say, okay, you can hate me all you want, doesn't matter? Or will the candidate want to at least be relatively tolerable? And there's a huge difference between voting methods on this. I call the metric here that I invented candidate incentive distributions. There are some other models, but yeah, those are a couple of metrics that I think are very good to look at when you're evaluating and working to understand voting methods.
Thank you, Marcus. Anyone else want to chime in here? How can we get, or no, I'm sorry. What are the big picture metrics that we should be looking at when picking a voting method?
I have things to add, but I want to hear from Nicolaus Tideman here. You're one of the greats in this space.
Well, I think Marcus covered it pretty well. I happen to be particularly fond of the idea that the candidate who beats all the others head to head is the right one to win. But I'm prepared to entertain the possibility that there are other metrics of what it means to elect the right candidate. there are interesting possibilities of using survey data to construct imitation elections and evaluate voting methods with these. Although I think that the better results are going to come now that we have many elections where voters have ranked the candidates. But although in these elections we don't know how strongly voters cared about the candidates they voted for. I'll leave it at that.
I would add that another difficulty of yielding real-world election results for data is that strategic voting can be a factor. So under a ranked choice election, for example, voters have an incentive to rank more candidates who they might think have broad appeal higher than those they don't. Basically, you want to rank somebody you think could win in the final round if they make it that far. High. And ranked choice is a lot better than plurality in this regard, but we still shouldn't view the ranked choice election results as the ground truth of what voters really think. I agree with Nicholas, though, that survey data is a promising data source for this.
From a campaign communications perspective, as someone who generally focuses on that aspect, I'd say two things. One, in general, I wouldn't express a strong preference based on the ability of winning a campaign to actually implement and actually have voters get the benefit of that, because I think, based on what we talked about earlier, if you're communicating on values and impact, you can make the case for any voting method. But of course, there is some benefit to simplicity of explaining for voters, for opinion thought leaders, nonprofits and political leaders to be able to actually understand the way a voting method works. There are obvious benefits there. So to the degree that it can be explained rather simply and concisely, there is a benefit in terms of getting opinion leaders on board.
All right, let's go on to the next question. This one's for Dr. Tideman. How do the mathematical conclusions impact real-world implementation? So the theoretical impacting what actually happens.
Well, the theory always depends on assumptions, and the assumptions that matter might not be true. I think that theory gives us ideas about what deserves exploration, but then we have to look at actual implementation in order to know what counts. So I think that's about all I can say.
I'm going to a quick follow-up here, because is it better to look at statistical analysis of voting methods, or should we actually go at it with specific criteria in mind? Like, it's kind of, this is where I struggle when I try to think about this stuff. I'm always thinking about like, oh, these, I'm not thinking about it mathematically at all when I think about this stuff. So,
yeah, well, when I tried to figure out how to evaluate voting rules, I came up with two criteria. I was using survey data, and the question was, what is the average ranking of the winner, and how susceptible are voting rules to strategic voting? It seemed to me that those were the two criteria that it made the most sense to look at. And in my view, we should look at susceptibility to strategy as a serious bar to a number of methods that are quite susceptible to it. And among those that aren't so susceptible to strategy, we want to then ask how good are the outcomes apparently, and then we want to ask the subjective questions. Will people treat them the way we expected them to treat them? I'm recovering from an illness. I'm sorry about the squeaky voice. Maybe that's enough.
okay. Anyone else want to chime in about how the mathematical conclusions impacting real world implementation. How do you marry those
Yeah.
two?
Yeah, one of the big problems that I see that's come out of academia is, Arrow's theorem and the idea that we're evaluating voting methods with criteria, pass fail. And if a voting method, well, first off, no voting method passes all of the criteria that are desirable. And so no method is perfect. And so don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Let's just go with whatever. And it's a great way to just discount science like carte blanche, just like throw it all out and say like, the science doesn't answer the question, let's move on. And that has done a huge disservice. Obviously, that's not the takeaway that people should take from that science, but it is the takeaway I think that the ranked choice voting lobby in particular has taken from it. And then the criteria approach has another huge issue where advocates can just cherry pick the criteria that their method passes and fail to mention the existence of other criteria whatsoever. So I think the big famous dichotomy there is favorite betrayal criterion, which ensures it's safe to vote for your favorite, or you should always give your favorite full support, versus later no harm, which is it's safe and you always should, show additional support down ballot for other candidates. And we know that in practice, it's impossible to pass both of these. So that's where, to me, statistical analysis becomes really, really important, because in school, if you pass something with a 99, if you get 99% on the test, that's not a fail. Like, are there systems that can get 99% on both? So I think it's really important to not cherry pick considerations and to have a more holistic approach so that we are really looking at the bigger picture. We're looking from an equal vote perspective. Our 5 pillars are equality. The weight and worth of every citizen's vote should be equal. Accuracy. The voting method should accurately elect representative winners who reflect the will of the people. Honesty. It should be smart and good and incentivized to vote your conscience. Expressive. The ballot should allow you to express enough data that the voting method can do its job. And simplicity. It should be safe, or it should be, simple to explain the method, simple to vote, simple to audit, simple to tally, simple to have secure, good, user-friendly elections. And then the Equal Vote Coalition does have one criteria that, I led with there, which is the equality criterion, which is that if the election were tied and we have polar opposite opinions, and maybe I'm in the minority, I've only got one candidate, or I've got 3 candidates on my side, and you've got 1 candidate on your side. If we all vote equal and opposite, will the election still be tied? Or if we both vote equal and opposite, will the election still be tied? And so that's called the test of balance. And, obviously, if it's a black and white 2-candidate election, any voting method passes. I vote black, you vote white, it's tied. But if there's 3 or more, approval voting, ranked robin, the Condorcet methods, and star voting all pass that test.
I'd like to chime in now and add to what Sarah said. I want to endorse her idea that we don't want to look at yes/no criteria. Does it always pass this criterion, or does it sometimes fail? We want to ask, how often does it fail if it fails? It just doesn't make sense to look at these criteria as something that if it happens one time in a billion, that's a failure. We have to look at the data and ask how often it matters in real elections. And then I wanted to say something about Arrow's theorem. It took me a long time to understand Arrow's theorem, but I think that the simple version of Arrow's theorem is that a simple cycle shows that you can't rely on majority rule. And if you assume you can rely on majority rule, you get into trouble. That would be my description of the Arrow theorem.
I like it. Simple. Anyone else want to add something to this before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I wasn't expecting to have something to add to this because I'm certainly not a, a learned voting methods expert the way that other folks are here. But some things that Sarah said really resonated. And as someone who helped pick the voting system that we now use in the city of St. Louis, we took that honest approach that I think Sarah laid out when it comes to looking holistically at all the different criteria in determining what we wanted to use. So for us, the vote from a vote splitting and crowded field perspective, approval voting seemed like a great option. But we also were hearing some, legitimate concerns about potential bullet voting, which is of course a legitimate voting approach and something that we've even heard from some of the leaders of the approval voting method in Fargo is something that people do. It's a legitimate way to use the system. But it was something that obviously some people don't like as a possibility. And so we did something similar to what, the folks who created Star Voting did, which was we tried to create a system that combined different positive elements and incentives into something that could be manifested in the real world. St. Louis City didn't had like an antiquated patchwork of voting equipment. So we knew it had to be simple to use at a large scale. And this is what I really want to emphasize is we get so caught up sometimes, I think, in this community around the voting method, and we need to look at what context is it taking place in terms of open primaries or separate primaries or closed primaries, or, also, if you're having primaries and general elections, like how can we make it work and fit as many criteria as strongly as possible for a positive experience that reflects the will of the people in a context. And I think like open primaries, a combined unified primary is an important part of any election experience, regardless of the voting method. I think it's strengthened and more representative. Of course, you all probably know many exceptions because you all are the experts in the field and I'm not. But, so that's why we did approval voting in an open primary, nonpartisan primary, followed by a top two runoff in the general election. And St. Louis already had a primary and a general election. So we didn't change that. And for the everyday voter, people are really familiar with and comfortable with a top two runoff. They see it happening in cities all over the region and all over the country. And it feels logical and rational. I know we've heard from some approval voting advocates who say that's stupid, that you have a runoff. You don't need that with approval voting. But we were also listening to the folks who had concerns about bullet voting. And so we're able to create a system that works for people. And I will also emphasize, as voting methods practitioners, to practice what we preach. When it comes to finding common ground, finding that candidate or electoral outcome that is supported by the most people, I think it's important for us to work together in a constructive way and listen to different people's perspectives and concerns about different criteria to try to arrive at that electoral reform that is supported by the most people. And I feel like we were able to do that by bringing that holistic approach. And you will see now in St. Louis, different political organizations, nonprofit organizations, unions, chambers of commerce will endorse two candidates at a time. And now people have an incentive to actually use approval voting because they have an incentive to get their two favorite candidates into the general election. And of course, we heard what ifs from opponents who said, oh, people are going to be incentivized to pick their favorite candidate and their least favorite candidate so that their favorite candidate will have a cakewalk once they get to the general election. That's not happening in the real world.
Mhm.
We're already almost at a time here. Okay.
No, it's going by so fast.
Yeah.
I know we could talk about this for hours, but we did want to make sure we give people a chance to go into breakout rooms so that they can talk to each other and maybe some other panelists. So we're going to go ahead and get that set up now, and really appreciate everybody being here.